In this chapter, we're going to look at deterrence and incapacitation and whether or not it's possible to control delinquency by punishing more and punishing more severely. So a lot of times the juvenile system is criticized for not being very tough. Some have argued that the system needs to get tough with offenders, especially serious offenders. So are we tough enough? So as mentioned, the juvenile system is often criticized for not being tough enough. A large majority of cases are referred to juvenile court, have their cases dismissed, handled informally, or placed on probation. They often have little contact with their probation officers and often only have minimal sanctions. Even when we look at serious offenders, they often don't receive serious sanctions. And so the juvenile court is less likely than the adult court to incarcerate serious offenders. So deterrence. The U.S. Office of Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention has a comprehensive strategy. They want to hold juveniles accountable through swift, consistent application of sanctions that are proportionate to offenses. And so they recommend a system of graduated sanctions. Immediate sanctions for first-time nonviolent offenders, intermediate sanctions for serious offenders, and then secure care programs for the most violent offenders. And so states then alter their mission statements to emphasize accountability and punishment along with rehabilitation. So some of the ways we've tried to get tough with serious offenders is to make more efficient use of court staff and divert less serious cases out of the system, and employ risk assessment strategies in order to properly classify offenders. We've also tried to use more severe sanctions. That includes things like intermediate sanctions, mandatory minimums, sentencing guidelines, blended sentences, waiver, and reducing the confidentiality of the juvenile court proceedings. So get tough policies increase the rate at which juveniles were subjected to the following. So they were more likely to be referred to court, processed formally, adjudicated delinquent, subject to intermediate sanctions, sent to institutions, waived to court, and confined in adult prisons. Recall that deterrence is based on the fear of punishment. Increasing the fear of punishment by increasing certainty and severity of punishment. The idea here then is that fear of punishment will deter those who are punished as well as those who are aware of those punishments. And this is compatible with control and social learning theories. Specific deterrence aims to deter those specific offenders who are punished from further offending. When we look at studies of this, we find studies that compare subsequent delinquency of juveniles who receive more and less severe punishment suggest that get tough approaches have no effect on future offending. Those that compare arrested or convicted offenders to comparable offenders who have not been arrested or convicted finds that formally punishing offenders does not reduce subsequent delinquency. So why is this not having the effect we would think it would have? Could be that the system doesn't punish in a way that's very effective. The juveniles might not be responsive to punishment. The punishment probably does very little to address major causes of delinquency. And punishment may actually increase the likelihood of subsequent crime by increasing strain, social learning of crime, and labeling, and reducing social control. So what might increase the effectiveness of punishment? Well, one problem with punishment is that it's not very certain. So if the likelihood was reasonably high, that might make it more effective. If punished individuals actually have concern for the cost of crime, punishments combined with rehabilitation, and if steps are taken to minimize negative effects. Studies do tell us, though, that punishment combined with rehabilitation is effective even when that treatment is coerced. You might be familiar with the concept of restorative justice. Restorative justice is a dialogue between victim and offender on the harm caused and how it can be repaired. Usually consists of a conference that includes the offender's family and supporters, victim supporters, and representatives from the community. The offender often apologizes, makes restitution, and performs community service. The idea here is to hold the offender accountable, for the offender to repair the harm they have caused, to restore ties with conventional others, and address other causes of delinquency. So our overall conclusion here is that punishing juveniles more severely does not reduce subsequent delinquency. but properly administered punishments can, with a key emphasis being on the certainty of that punishment. General deterrence is the idea that punishment exists and therefore you won't engage in delinquent behavior because you don't want to be punished. And so some studies in this area have compared areas that differ in terms of certainty and or severity. It's difficult to determine causal effect here, so any association could be due to third-party variables. Certainty measured in terms of arrest rate and severity measured in terms of average length of prison. That's how those variables were measured. Longitudinal studies try to take account of those third-party variables because it should allow us to look at the order in which those variables occurred so that we can properly determine cause and effect. Some examine whether certainty or severity at one point in time affects crime rates at subsequent points in time. And then self-report studies often ask people the likelihood they would be punished if they commit a particular offense and what they think their punishment should be. Or what they think their punishment would be. There are some tentative conclusions here about general deterrence. Increasing the certainty of punishment may reduce crime by a moderate amount in some circumstances, but punishment is only one factor that influences the level of crime. And it's less important than things like our individual beliefs and the threat of informal punishment from family members and others. So changes in severity of punishment have little or no effect on delinquency. So punishment is short-lived and confined to a specific area in which the punishment is administered. Punishments administered outside of one's community have very little effect. We do know that combining punishment with rehabilitation is effective, so punishing juveniles more severely does not reduce subsequent delinquency, but properly administered punishments can reduce delinquency. What about increasing the severity of the punishment? It's really easy for politicians to pass laws that increase the severity. It makes them seem like they're tough on crime. And it's also possible to increase the certainty of punishment in a way that reduces delinquency rates by rotating crackdowns, making better use of community policing efforts, and providing more resources to juvenile courts and corrections. So let's talk about incapacitation. The basic idea here is to lock up serious and or high-rate juvenile offenders for long periods. If they're locked up, they're incapacitated and cannot commit crimes on the street. So one of the things we would do here to study this is try to estimate how many crimes incarcerated offenders commit each year when they're free. But this exaggerates the size of incapacitation effect for a number of reasons. First of all, just because one offender is locked up doesn't mean that nobody else will take their place. There's often a substitution effect. Locking up one juvenile can have little effect on crimes committed in groups. Many juvenile offenders substantially reduce their level of offending towards the end of adolescence anyway. And high-rate offenders are already more likely to be locked up, so locking up additional offenders may not prevent as many crimes as estimated. Some alternative strategies to estimate incapacitation effects would allow us to compare states or other areas with different rates of incarceration to determine whether those with high incarceration rates have lower crime rates, or to examine incarceration and crime rates in the same area over time. Adult studies suggest an increase in incarceration has a modest effect on crime. A 10% increase in incarceration is associated with a 2 to 4% lower crime rate. As incarceration rates increase, the effects are reduced because now we're confining more low-rate offenders. We don't really know how these apply to juveniles. Juveniles are confined at about half the rate of adults and are more likely to offend in groups. Juveniles are also released while still relatively young, so the effect on juvenile crime is likely to be pretty modest. The idea of selective incapacitation is to try to distinguish the high-rate offenders from low-rate offenders and confine high-rate offenders for long periods of time. But it's difficult to distinguish them. Many juveniles with extensive arrest records are inept, not high-rate offenders. Most high-rate offenders don't have extensive arrest records, and the risk assessments we use for differentiating them are just not accurate. There's also ethical issues here because essentially you're trying to punish somebody for something they might do in the future. So this probably prevents a modest amount of crime as well. But it carries a heavy price tag. It's expensive to build and maintain institutions, and alternatives may be more cost effective.